Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. 1000B. Here on Gate 404, we already covered the haunting mystery of Flight MH370. Now it's time to talk about a tragedy that didn't vanish without a trace, but burned itself into history. Sleek, fast, elite. 1000B. The Concorde was more than just a plane. It was a flying sports car for the ultra-wealthy. 1000B, a machine that outran time itself. But on July 25, 2000, that dream went up in flames, quite literally. In just 90 seconds, the world's most advanced passenger jet crashed on takeoff, killing everyone on board and 4 people on the ground. That wasn't just the end of a flight. 1000B. It was the death of an era, the end of supersonic passenger travel as we knew it. But what really happened that day? 1000 down. Why did Concorde, once a symbol of the future, vanish from our skies? 1000. And could it ever come back? Let's rewind to where it all began. In the aftermath of World War II, the world's imagination was captured by the sky. It wasn't enough to simply fly. The question on the minds of engineers and visionaries was, how fast can we go? The Cold War rivalry between the East and West fueled technological advancements, and as supersonic jets became the backbone of military aviation, the idea of a supersonic passenger plane became the ultimate ambition. By the 1950s, aviation had become a race, not just to fly faster, but to redefine the limits of human achievement in the sky. And in that race, 2 nations, France and the United Kingdom, set out to create a plane that would be the pinnacle of speed, an aircraft that would defy the conventional boundaries of time and space. The Concorde program didn't start with a handshake. It began with fierce ambition. Both Britain and France were independently working on concepts for a supersonic passenger plane, but the cost and technological challenges were so overwhelming that the only solution was to combine their efforts. In 1962, the French and British governments signed an agreement marking the birth of the Concorde program. The collaboration was both an engineering triumph and a political compromise. France's Sud Aviation and Britain's British Aircraft Corporation, BAC, would share the responsibilities. France would focus on the wings, while Britain would tackle the engines. But the marriage of these 2 powers wasn't entirely smooth. The project faced constant budget cuts, design conflicts, and technological struggles, yet it managed to push forward. The dream of a supersonic commercial flight was no longer just a fantasy. It was becoming a reality. The name Concorde was more than just a title. It symbolized the union of 2 nations working together to overcome seemingly impossible odds. In a world divided by the Cold War, the Concorde became a beacon of international collaboration. On March 2, 1969, the world held its breath as Concorde 001 took to the skies for its first test flight at Toulouse-Blagnac Airport in France. Piloted by André Turcat, the Concorde soared into the heavens, marking a monumental moment in aviation history. At that moment, the world was introduced to a plane that could fly faster than the speed of sound, more than twice the speed of a regular jet. With a cruising speed of Mach 2, around 1,354 mph or 2,180 km/h, the Concorde was capable of flying from London to New York in just 3.5 hours, a journey that normally took over 7 hours. In a world where air travel was still associated with long and tiring flights, Concorde seemed like the epitome of luxury, speed, and convenience. The first flight of Concorde was not just a technical achievement, it was an emotional moment. The plane's sleek design, its delta wings, and its sharp nose made it a sight to behold. It didn't just look fast, it looked like the future, and it soared through the skies with a grace that was both beautiful and powerful. It was the aviation equivalent of a sports car, a symbol of power, speed, and precision. But while Concorde was undeniably fast, it was also about the experience. It was more than just transportation. It was a prestige symbol, a mark of elite status. Flying on Concorde wasn't about saving time. It was about securing a place in the exclusive club of the world's richest, most powerful, and most famous people. The tickets weren't just expensive, they were astronomically priced. A round-trip ticket from London to New York could cost over $10,000, well beyond the reach of most people. But those who could afford it didn't just want to get from point A to point B. They wanted to be seen. Celebrities, royalty, politicians, and corporate executives filled the plush seats of Concorde, creating a club of privilege in the sky. The experience was exclusive. The cabins were designed with luxury in mind, spacious, elegant, and equipped with everything from caviar to fine wine. The sheer speed was only part of the allure. The most coveted aspect of flying Concorde was the status it conferred. When you flew Concorde, you weren't just traveling. You were making a statement to the world about who you were. Concorde versus regular flights, the ultimate comparison. In the era of commercial air travel, most flights took hours upon hours to reach their destinations. A typical New York to Paris flight could take upwards of 8 hours. The idea that you could cut that time in half was revolutionary. The world had never seen anything like it. Concorde didn't just offer a faster alternative to commercial airliners, it redefined the concept of time. Passengers could board the plane in London or Paris, enjoy a luxurious meal at 60,000 feet, and still have plenty of time for a full day in New York. Concorde wasn't just about cutting time, it was about making time irrelevant. In an era where air travel was a tedious chore, this supersonic wonder made the journey feel like an adventure in and of itself. It gave people the ability to bend time. And for those lucky enough to board, every journey was an invitation to join a new era of aviation. While Concorde's sheer speed and luxurious design captured the imagination of the world, the true marvel of the aircraft lay in its cutting-edge technology. Every component of the Concorde, from its engines to its aerodynamic structure, was built to push the boundaries of what was possible in aviation. However, with innovation came certain compromises, and some of Concorde's flaws would ultimately contribute to its untimely demise. At the heart of Concorde's supersonic performance were the Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus 593 engines. These engines were a marriage between two of the most prestigious names in aerospace, Britain's Rolls-Royce and France's Snecma. Designed to operate at speeds over Mach 2 and at an altitude of 60,000 feet, the Olympus 593 engines were a technical feat. They delivered immense thrust and power, but they came with their own set of challenges. The engines were designed to operate under extreme conditions. Their afterburners, which burned fuel at high temperatures to create the necessary thrust, meant that the Concorde had a far higher fuel consumption rate compared to subsonic jets. This fuel efficiency problem was one of the first signs that Concorde would face difficulties in becoming a mainstream commercial option. Moreover, the engines were noisy, producing sounds that were several times louder than conventional airliners. While their power made the aircraft supersonic, it also made them incredibly inefficient in terms of fuel and environmental impact, which would become a significant problem over time. From its sleek delta wings to its moving nose, Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a piece of aerodynamic art. The delta wing design was essential for Concorde's supersonic speeds. This triangular wing shape allowed the Concorde to maintain stability at high speeds and provided aerodynamic lift while reducing drag. Another remarkable feature of the Concorde was its variable nose. the nose of the Concorde could tilt downward to improve visibility during takeoff and landing. When flying at supersonic speeds, the nose was raised to reduce drag and improve aerodynamics. This seemingly simple yet ingenious design was crucial for both safety and performance. But Concorde's design wasn't just about speed, it was about surviving the extremes. The materials used in the aircraft were specially chosen to withstand the intense heat generated by air friction at supersonic speeds. Titanium, ceramic, and other heat-resistant alloys were used extensively in the construction. The plane's outer skin would heat up significantly during flight, requiring cooling systems to maintain structural integrity. Concorde's design came with some fascinating thermal dynamics. As the plane reached supersonic speeds, the friction with the air caused the fuselage to expand and shrink. In essence, Concorde would shrink by several inches in length due to the heat it generated during flight. This phenomenon was due to the thermal expansion of the aircraft's materials. As the plane hit speeds greater than Mach 2, the metal components of the fuselage would heat up, causing them to expand, thus slightly shortening the plane's length. This odd behavior was a known issue and a key consideration in Concorde's engineering. It was a necessary compromise to achieve supersonic speeds, but added another layer of complexity to its operation and maintenance. Despite Concorde's technological brilliance, it was plagued by several limitations that ultimately hindered its commercial success. Perhaps the most significant of these was the noise. Concorde's sonic boom, the thunderous sound produced when it broke the sound barrier, was so disruptive that many countries around the world banned Concorde flights from flying over their land at supersonic speeds. It was only allowed to fly supersonic over oceans, which restricted its routes and made it impractical for many markets. Additionally, Concorde's fuel consumption was astronomical. At cruising speeds, the aircraft burned fuel at an incredible rate, nearly 4 times the fuel consumption of conventional airliners. This made each flight expensive to operate and unsustainable for long-term commercial viability, especially as fuel prices continued to rise in the 1970s and 1980s. Finally, Concorde was designed for a very narrow market. It was only capable of carrying around 100 passengers in a luxury configuration, limiting its revenue potential. As global aviation saw increasing demand for larger, more affordable planes capable of carrying hundreds of passengers, Concorde's small capacity made it a niche product reserved for the wealthiest clients. This narrow focus meant that Concorde could never achieve the widespread popularity necessary to make the project financially sustainable. Concorde's maintenance was another major challenge. The aircraft's advanced technology, complex systems, and unique materials made it expensive to service. For instance, the engines required frequent maintenance, and the specialized parts used in its construction were not cheap to replace. In addition, Concorde's high speed created wear and tear on components, particularly the brakes, tires, and engines. Because Concorde flew at such high speeds, the stress on the plane's structure was immense, meaning that the maintenance cycle was frequent and expensive. Each flight was essentially high risk because of the immense pressure placed on the aircraft's systems. Despite the aircraft's luxurious reputation, it came with hidden dangers. The very features that made it so extraordinary, the powerful engines, the sleek design, the supersonic speed, were also the sources of its fragility. This combination of high maintenance costs, environmental concerns, and operational restrictions created a situation where Concorde, despite being a technical marvel, could not fully integrate into the global aviation industry. The higher-ups had hoped that Concorde's prestige would justify the costs, but as the world's aviation market evolved, it became clear that this high-speed marvel had a limited lifespan. On July 25, 2000, Air France Flight 4590, a Concorde supersonic charter, was preparing for its journey from Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport to New York, carrying passengers eager for a quick and luxurious transatlantic flight. What began as a routine takeoff turned into a tragic and horrifying sequence of events that would lead to the destruction of one of aviation's greatest achievements. As the Concorde began its takeoff roll, everything seemed normal. The iconic aircraft, known for its grace and speed, began accelerating down the runway. The roar of its Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus 593 engines filled the air as the aircraft reached its takeoff speed. However, just seconds after becoming airborne, things started to go terribly wrong. At around 400 meters from the runway, the left main landing gear of the Concorde struck a piece of debris that had fallen from a DC-10 that had just taken off ahead of them. The debris was a metallic strip, just 0.3 meters long, but it caused catastrophic damage to the aircraft. The piece of metal punctured one of the Concorde's tires. The tire burst, and debris flew into the fuel tank, igniting a massive fire. Within seconds, the situation on board became critical. As the flames spread rapidly along the wing and the left engine failed, the pilots in the cockpit fought desperately to maintain control of the aircraft. The fire was consuming the left side of the Concorde, and the aircraft was losing thrust and altitude. Despite the pilots' experience and quick responses, the damage was too severe. The Concorde was no longer able to climb, and its ability to stay airborne diminished with every passing second. The passengers, many of whom were unaware of the severity of the situation, could feel the plane struggling. Cabin crew members were also realizing the danger, but had little time to act. The fire continued to spread, and the heat was so intense that the Concorde began to lose structural integrity. Meanwhile, the pilots in the cockpit were battling both the flames and the aircraft's failure to respond to control inputs. At 50 seconds after takeoff, the crew had already realized they couldn't return to the airport. The left engine had completely failed, and the fire was out of control. The plane began to descend, and it was clear they would not make it. At this point, the crew's options were limited. They tried desperately to find an area for a forced landing, but the fire had reached a critical stage, and it was too late. Surveillance cameras around the airport captured the heartbreaking moment when the Concorde began to fall. The flames could be seen trailing from the left wing, and eyewitnesses on the ground described seeing the aircraft nose up but failing to climb further, eventually tilting down toward the ground. The images of the Concorde trailing fire in its descent were a horrifying sight. People on the ground heard the deafening roar of the engines failing, and some described the sounds as a cry of anguish as the aircraft fought to stay aloft, only to lose the battle. In the cockpit, the pilots were frantically trying to regain control, with the fire spreading rapidly across the wing. The communication between the pilots reflected the panic and desperation of the situation. "We're on fire!" one of the pilots shouted. As the flames reached the fuselage and fuel tanks, the fire continued to ravage the aircraft. Within 1 minute of takeoff, the aircraft had lost almost all power, and it was clear the Concorde would not make it to safety. The aircraft descended at an alarming rate, and as it lost speed, it began to break apart mid-air. The left wing was heavily damaged, and as the Concorde reached the ground, it crashed into a hotel in the nearby Gonesse area, resulting in a massive explosion on impact. The Concorde's fiery end marked the culmination of a tragic and unforgettable moment. All 109 people on board, including 4 crew members, were killed, along with 4 people on the ground. Witnesses who saw the crash unfold on the ground recounted the horrific scene. Eyewitnesses described watching the Concorde soar into the sky before suddenly spiraling out of control, trailing fire behind it. The explosion on impact was heard from miles away. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but it was already too late for those on board the aircraft. What was meant to be a supersonic journey became one of the most tragic moments in aviation history. The cause of the crash was later determined to be the debris from the DC-10, but the circumstances surrounding the accident were far more complex. Fuel tank ruptures, extreme heat, and inadequate safety features in the Concorde contributed to the tragic outcome. Investigators noted the flammability of the Concorde's materials, particularly the fuel tank design, which made it more vulnerable to fires caused by impact damage. This tragic event shocked the aviation world and marked the beginning of the end for the Concorde, the icon of supersonic aviation. It was a devastating moment that raised questions about the aircraft's safety and its place in the future of air travel. As the wreckage of the Concorde smoldered, it became clear that a legend had come to an abrupt and tragic end. The crash of Air France Flight 4590 on July 25, 2000, sent shockwaves through the aviation world. The Concorde, a technological marvel, had been designed to break records and redefine air travel, but its final flight ended in a fiery disaster. What exactly went wrong that day? The investigation that followed uncovered a series of events and technical flaws that ultimately led to one of the most tragic accidents in aviation history. The immediate cause of the disaster was a small titanium debris that fell from the DC-10 aircraft ahead of the Concorde on the runway. This piece of metal, just a few inches long, would prove to be a tiny but devastating catalyst. During the takeoff roll, this debris struck the left main tire of the Concorde, causing the tire to burst. This was no ordinary tire burst. The force of the explosion sent fragments flying into the underside of the Concorde's left wing, directly puncturing the fuel tank. The fuel tank rupture created a massive fire, which quickly spread to the left engine and wing area. The Concorde's fuel system was not designed to withstand such an impact, and the flames spread incredibly fast. At this point, the aircraft's pilots were still unaware of the severity of the situation, but the fire was already raging, eating away at the wing and vital systems. As the fire intensified, the pilot's ability to control the aircraft diminished rapidly. Once the tire exploded, the damage was irreparable. The fire ignited by the ruptured fuel tank spread so quickly that the left engine failed, and the flight controls became less responsive. But the Concorde's design made the situation even more difficult to manage. One of the core issues was that the fireproofing materials in the Concorde's fuselage were not up to the task. When fuel tank ruptures occur in conventional aircraft, the fire is often contained by fire-retardant materials. However, the Concorde's structure wasn't built with this in mind. The extreme heat from the fire spread throughout the wing, severely damaging critical systems and making any attempts to stabilize the aircraft virtually impossible. But why was the crew unable to stop the disaster? As the aircraft continued to climb, it became evident that the left engine had failed completely and the fire was out of control. The crew initially tried to maintain the aircraft's altitude and tried to put out the fire, but the intensity of the flames and the damaged systems made this a futile attempt. There was no way to return to the airport, as the aircraft had already reached the critical point of no return. The Concorde's avionics, including the flight control system, began to malfunction due to the fire. The plane was increasingly difficult to maneuver, and it became clear that no matter how skilled the pilots were, the damage was too severe to overcome. As the investigation continued, the BEA, Bureau d'Enquête et d'Analyse, the French Air Accident Investigation Agency, identified several crucial flaws in the aircraft's design and safety features. One of the primary issues was the fuel tank design. The tanks were not well protected from external impact, which led to the fuel leak when the titanium debris punctured the tank. The lack of proper fire containment systems made it almost impossible to prevent the fire from spreading after the rupture. The investigation also revealed that no system was in place to automatically extinguish fires in the fuel tanks. Unlike other modern aircraft, where fire suppression systems are deployed as soon as a fire is detected in a tank, the Concorde lacked such a mechanism. The absence of fail-safe measures proved to be critical. Another problem that came to light was the weight distribution and aerodynamic structure of the Concorde. The aircraft's design, which prioritized supersonic speed, had sacrificed some elements of safety for performance. The Concorde's delta wing design and narrow fuselage made it less stable in emergency situations. The fire caused by the punctured fuel tank led to further destabilization, as the aircraft was now struggling with both loss of thrust and structural damage. Ultimately, the BEA investigation concluded that the titanium debris from the DC-10 was the direct trigger, but several other factors combined to bring down the Concorde. The lack of fire protection in the fuel tanks, the aircraft's fragile fuel system, and the difficulties of piloting the Concorde in an emergency all contributed to the disaster.
This is one way of getting above the Earth's atmosphere, practically and for all intents and purposes. The Concorde will be flying along the track of totality for this eclipse, joining it on the Mauritanian side, moving into the totality area and crossing it gradually over a whole distance of about 1,000 miles. Now the plan here is to keep pace with the moon's shadow as it crosses the desert. As you know, the shadow will be moving at something like 1,500 miles an hour, and this is one way of keeping pace with that movement. The shadow is a tiny circular dot on the desert, and if Concorde stays in the center of that dot for as long as it can, we can have an eclipse instead of 6 or 7 minutes lasting for up to an hour and more. So this is the Concorde plan. Experiments have been installed on the aircraft, poking through holes that have been cut in the shell, looking straight out at the sun through a minimum of Earth's atmosphere. We are undoubtedly assured of some very effective results from this sort of experiment. One of the experiments that's being carried on Concorde this time will be to investigate the appearance of the corona in infrared light. Now this requires specific technique. Above all, it needs to be clear of the Earth's atmosphere, so this equipment is being flown at a very high altitude, and the equipment will poke straight through the side of Concorde, which has been quite an expensive operation to get the panels made, of course, and then observations will be made at that right temperature.
Of millions was grounded, marking the beginning of the end for the supersonic jet. Grounded, Concorde is retired. In the wake of the tragedy, Air France and British Airways made the difficult decision to ground the entire fleet of Concorde aircraft. The world's only commercial supersonic airliner was temporarily suspended from flying while investigations into the disaster were conducted. Despite the investigations and efforts to determine exactly what went wrong, the Concorde's reputation was forever tarnished. It wasn't just the technical faults that had been exposed. The disaster had struck at the very heart of the Concorde's glamorous image. By the time the Concorde returned to the skies, changes had been made to its design to address some of the vulnerabilities exposed by the accident. The aircraft underwent extensive modifications to improve safety, such as installing titanium fuel tanks and replacing the tires with reinforced versions that were less likely to rupture under the force of debris. Yet, despite these efforts, the damage to the Concorde's public perception was profound. Attempts to improve the design, titanium tanks, reinforced tires. In an attempt to bring the Concorde back into commercial service, Air France and British Airways invested in a number of upgrades. The most notable improvements were the titanium fuel tanks, designed to prevent the sort of catastrophic ruptures that occurred during the crash, and reinforced tires to reduce the risk of debris punctures. These modifications were made to ensure that the Concorde would be safer and more resilient in future flights. However, these upgrades did little to stem the growing sense that the Concorde's time had passed. Despite the aircraft's iconic status, there were persistent challenges with its economics. The Concorde was still an incredibly expensive aircraft to maintain and operate, and these upgrades only added to the costs. With the plane's original design flaws and limited market for supersonic travel, the financial viability of the Concorde was more questionable than ever. Why it wasn't enough: terrorism, 9/11, and the economy. The Concorde's comeback was short-lived. Even before the tragedy of 9/11, the aviation industry was undergoing significant changes. The rise of low-cost carriers, the increasing focus on fuel efficiency, and growing concerns about the environmental impact of supersonic jets all placed immense pressure on Concorde's continued operation. The 9/11 terrorist attacks dealt the final blow to the Concorde program. The global aviation industry was brought to its knees by the attacks, and with it, the luxury market for supersonic travel took a massive hit. The increased security measures, the plummeting demand for high-priced luxury air travel, and the overall economic downturn all contributed to the airline industry rethinking its priorities. The Concorde, with its high operating costs, was no longer a viable asset in this new era. The aircraft's fuel consumption, its reliance on highly expensive materials, and its limited passenger capacity made it unsustainable in the long term, especially when compared to modern aircraft capable of flying long distances with far better fuel efficiency. The final flight, farewell to an era. On October 24, 2003, Concorde made its final commercial flight, marking the end of an era in aviation history. It was a symbolic flight, and the moment that millions had waited for had finally arrived. For the passengers who boarded that final journey, it was a bittersweet farewell to a marvel of engineering that had once promised to make the world smaller and to turn supersonic flight into something ordinary. The final flight from London Heathrow to New York was not just the last leg of a long journey for the aircraft, but also the final chapter of the Concorde's history. The plane had been part of a revolution in aviation, carrying not just passengers, but the dreams of those who believed that speed could define the future of air travel. The final landing at John F. Kennedy International Airport was met with a standing ovation from the crew, airport personnel, and onlookers. It was an emotional moment for everyone involved, as the Concorde symbolized not just progress, but also the cultural spirit of the times when it was first conceived. Concorde had once been the pinnacle of luxury air travel, a vessel that conveyed power, prestige, and the promise of tomorrow. But in the end, it was not the limits of engineering that brought it down. It was a confluence of economic realities, evolving market conditions, and societal changes that rendered it obsolete. The dream of supersonic air travel would have to wait for another day, and it would be years before anyone seriously considered a new generation of commercial supersonic aircraft. With its retirement, the Concorde program was brought to a close. It was no longer just a technological marvel. It had become a relic of a bygone era, a reminder of the ambitious dreams that sometimes fail to survive the complexities of the real world. The end of an era. The retirement of the Concorde left a sense of loss, not just for aviation enthusiasts, but also for anyone who had ever flown on it or dreamed of flying on it. The Concorde had represented the pinnacle of human achievement in aviation, a symbol of speed, luxury, and innovation. Its retirement marked the end of an era in aviation, a time when technological advancements pushed the boundaries of what was possible. The supersonic age, it seemed, had come to an end. As aviation technology continues to advance, the dream of commercial supersonic travel still lingers on. But for now, the Concorde remains a beautiful and tragic reminder of a time when humanity sought to conquer the skies in the most spectacular fashion possible. Since Concorde's last flight nearly 2 decades ago, its legacy has remained significant. While Concorde went down in history as a symbol of the unattainable dream of mass supersonic passenger flights, its influence continues to echo in aviation today. The world of aviation has changed, and the question of whether supersonic air travel will return in the future is still very much up in the air. Concorde became more than just an aircraft. It was a symbol of engineering achievement, luxury, and technological ambition. Every flight was an event, and the concept of supersonic air travel became the embodiment of what was once thought impossible. When Concorde ceased operations, its status as a cultural icon only grew. The aircraft can now be found in aviation museums around the world, including prominent ones like the Seattle Museum of Flight and the London Science Museum. These exhibits attract thousands of aviation enthusiasts and tourists, serving as a reminder of a time when supersonic speed was not just a fantasy, but a reality. Concorde became more than just a significant moment in aviation. It became embedded in pop culture. Its image frequently appears in films, books, and documentaries. The word Concorde became synonymous with elite and prestigious. And even though the aircraft no longer flies, its impact on public consciousness remains strong. However, the dream of supersonic flight did not die with Concorde. In recent years, several companies and organizations have returned to the idea of creating supersonic passenger planes. One of the most ambitious efforts is the Boom Supersonic Project. This company is developing a model of a supersonic aircraft called the Overture, which, according to plans, aims to revive the Concorde concept with modern technologies and demands. Overture promises to be more fuel efficient, have lower noise levels, and be overall greener than Concorde. The company intends to begin initial test flights in the mid-2020s, with plans to have regular commercial flights by the 2030s. However, like Concorde, the project faces technical, financial, and regulatory challenges, including environmental concerns and fuel costs. In addition, NASA has also been working on the concept of supersonic flight, although their focus is on experimental rather than commercial applications. Their X-59 Qui SST aircraft is designed to explore how to achieve supersonic speeds without producing the loud sonic boom. This aircraft is being tested to reduce the noise produced by supersonic flights over land, making it more acceptable for use in populated areas. Much like Boom Supersonic, the NASA X-59 shows interest in the future of supersonic travel, but also grapples with issues such as noise regulation and environmental sustainability. The future of supersonic aviation remains uncertain. On the one hand, advancements in technology and materials science have opened new possibilities for more efficient and environmentally friendly supersonic aircraft. Modern developments aim to address many of the drawbacks of the old Concorde, such as its fuel-hungry engines, high noise levels, and expensive operational costs. However, there are still many questions that may slow the return of supersonic flights. The biggest hurdle, however, remains environmental concerns. Supersonic aircraft consume large amounts of fuel and produce significant carbon emissions, which is becoming an increasingly important issue in a world that is pushing for carbon neutrality.
Experiments have been
The
installed on the
aviation
aircraft.
industry, undergoing
poking through
pressure,
holes that have been cut in the
faces the
shell,
challenge of reducing
looking
its carbon
straight out
footprint.
at the sun through a
And this could
minimum of
become the
Earth's
deciding
atmosphere.
factor
We're
in the
undoubtedly
revival of
assured of some
supersonic air
very
travel.
effective results from this sort of experiment.
Noise also remains a major issue,
One of the experiments
especially
that's
for
being
flights
carried
over
on Concorde
populated
this
areas.
time will be to investigate
Many
the appearance of
governments
the
and
corona
international
in infrared
organizations
light.
are still
Now, this
debating
requires
restrictions on
specific
supersonic
techniques.
flights,
Above
which
all,
could
it
threaten
needs
the
to be
commercial
clear of the Earth's
viability of such
atmosphere.
services.
So this equipment's being flown at a
Furthermore,
very high altitude,
there's the issue of
and
cost.
the equipment will poke straight through
Despite
the side of
technological
Concorde, which has been
progress,
quite an expensive
supersonic
operation
planes
to
will
get
still
the panels
likely be
made,
much
of course,
more expensive
and
than
then
regular commercial
observations will
jets.
be made at that
This
right
creates a
temperature.
barrier to wide accessibility for passengers and means that supersonic flights would likely remain a luxury service for a select group of travelers. Thus, supersonic air travel may be on the horizon once again, but for now, it seems more like a dream than an imminent reality. While projects like Boom Supersonic and NASA X-59 lay the groundwork for a return to supersonic flight, it remains unclear whether these planes will ever become more than marketing tools for the aviation industry. There are simply too many factors to consider, from economics and ecology to technology and regulation. Concorde was the trailblazer, but its legacy may be more about inspiring future generations to find new ways to make supersonic travel a reality. When and if the time is right, Concorde's story is one of grandeur and tragedy, a tale of a machine that was ahead of its time. While the catastrophic crash of Air France Flight 4590 on July 25, 2000, marked the physical end of this legendary aircraft, it wasn't just that single accident that caused its downfall. Concorde's ultimate demise was tied to something more profound. It simply arrived too early. The Concorde was a marvel of engineering, a leap into a future where speed and luxury could redefine air travel. Yet it was too fast, too expensive, and too ahead of its time for the world that existed when it took to the skies. Its supersonic capabilities were unparalleled, but the costs, both financial and environmental, were overwhelming. For most of its operational life, only the wealthiest passengers could afford to experience it. The world wasn't ready for such a leap, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of the economic and environmental challenges that would come with it. Yet even in its decline, Concorde's legacy lives on. Its influence has outlasted its time in service, and its dream of supersonic flight continues to inspire new projects, from Boom Supersonic to NASA's X-59. The vision of a faster world still lingers in the collective imagination. As technology advances, there may yet be a future where supersonic travel becomes a more sustainable reality. As you sit by the window on a regular flight, and if you happen to spot a long, white contrail stretching across the sky, remember, the dream isn't over. It may have faded for now, but it still lives on in the skies, and in the hearts of those who dare to dream of a world where speed and freedom take on new meanings. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the legend of Concorde, don't forget to subscribe to Gate 404 for more stories from the world of aviation, where we continue to explore the past, present, and future of flight. Stay tuned for more episodes and keep looking up, because who knows, the skies might just surprise us.